All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Northern Forest Bird Network webinar series for 2025. So, Happy New Year to you all. I'm so glad you're here. And I'm really glad that Dave is joining us today to talk about American Goshawks. If you missed last month, we had Ryan Brady here, and he provided an overall species update for the region. And so, this year, we're going to kind of go in detail on each species that he kind of covered. So I'm really excited Dave was able to come in January here and talk about American Goshawk. Dave is on our Northern Forest Bird Steering Committee, and he is part of the Superior National Forest. So thanks, Dave. I'll let you take it away.
Great, sounds good. Thanks, Jamie. Glad to be here. Thanks everyone for joining. So yeah, as Jamie said, I'm gonna talk about American goshawks, not Northern goshawks anymore. Now that they split them apart, and kind of give you a crash course on some life history, some monitoring and research that is ongoing, and then kind of wrap it up by talking about some of the management considerations that that we use in Minnesota and in other states in the upper Midwest. So with that, I will move on. So yeah, like Jamie also said, I'm on the Superior. I'm based out of the Tofty Ranger District, and I'm a biologist there. So the goshawk distribution. Um, so the map on the left, goshawks are actually a whole Arctic. They have whole Arctic distribution, so they're across kind of the northern hemisphere, across the globe. The species is now split into American goshawk in North America, and then the Eurasian goshawk across the other part of the globe. So in North America, you can kind of see the distribution here. Um, the purple is kind of that year-round habitat, the range distribution that they're using. And then the blue is kind of where they would be found wintering. Goshawks are kind of an interesting species and actually not very well understood in terms of their migratory behavior. It is kind of thought that goshawks are a partial migrant. Um, Meaning that sometimes they move and sometimes they don't, especially depending on where they are in their range. So, like in northwestern Canada, there's been studies done that showed that goshawk followed hare cycles. So, in years when hare populations crashed, the goshawks left, and that's when they get detected more in that wintering, non-breeding distribution part of their range. So kind of an interesting bird, but I think there's still a lot left to know about that. Um, in Minnesota, um, they breed primarily in northeastern and north central Minnesota. You can see kind of the color coded counties is where where we have found active territories of goshawks. There's been about 200 documented territories since 1990, and in any given year, there's about 60 active territories that get monitored. Um, So, kind of talking a little bit about their reproductive chronology, and talking specifically more about the upper Midwest. As I kind of mentioned, it's thought that the upper Midwest populations are pretty much non-migratory, though there can be some extensive non-breeding season movements across the region. So, but once again, this is it's pretty poorly understood. So, in terms of when goshawks occupy their territories, the males typically show up first, and it varies depending on where you are in their range. But for kind of in the upper Midwest, it's February and March is when territories will get occupied. That reproductive chronology varies significantly by latitude, elevation, and elevation is more based on those populations that occur in Western US and in kind of the mountainous regions. Obviously by territory, then by year to year. The year to year variation is really influenced strongly by weather. So in years when we have a late spring, those territories often get occupied later than they do in years like last year. We had kind of an early spring, so occupancy was earlier. This is just another way to kind of depict that reproductive chronology, just to kind of give you an idea of when things are occurring between courtship and post-fledging. Their incubation period is about 30 days. They're in the nest for just over 30 days, kind of in that 32 to 36. And then they fledge. And once they fledge, they're not independent right away. And there's actually evidence to show that, sometimes the kids hang out in groups for a while. And actually, sometimes young goshawks get adopted by adjacent territories. Kind of talking a little bit about the goshawk nest. There's kind of their size and what they're made out of. Um, Goshawk nests are relatively large, from 2 feet to almost up to over 3 feet in diameter. Although they're really a large diameter nest, they're not super deep, relatively shallow, oftentimes around a foot in depth. And then the construction of the nest is relatively messy. That's a technical term. And they're, usually sticks of like an eighth to an inch in diameter. Um, and the picture on the left is actually a nest from the Western North America, more kind of in the mountainous regions, where there's a lot more conifer, and you can see quite a lot of conifer boughs in the nest. That does happen in the Great Lakes region. We do sometimes see greens on top of the nest, though most of the base of the nest is going to be deciduous branches or something that's not fresh greens. Um, and that is actually, in terms of that color-coded box there, one thing that we do look at when we're going to see if a nest is occupied or is active is to look at the ends of the sticks. And you can see in the picture on the left again that some of the ends of those branches are kind of pale color or yellowish almost. Those indicate like fresh breaks in the branch, meaning that the goshawk has brought those in that year. It's not from a previous year, and it's likely that the nest is actually active. Because a lot of times you can go to these territories and there may not be an adult around to let you know that the site is active. These are just some pictures of different goshawk nests. One thing that I think is important to recognize, especially you can see kind of in that picture in the middle, is the goshawk nest is in kind of this multi-crotched fork of a net, and that's an aspen tree there. Um, those kinds of forks are really important for any kind of stick nesting bird, especially a goshawk, something that builds a large nest, so that it can support the nest. Another thing about where goshawks nest is that they often are relatively higher up in the canopy. They're not usually at the top of the canopy, but more so kind of at the bottom of the canopy is where they would construct their nests. So they're relatively high, which is different than say like a broad-winged hawk, where the nests are there's a little bit smaller, but they're a lot lower in height, more so in the order of say 20 feet compared to 40 feet or higher in say a goshawk. Kind of switching to kind of habitat use, and this information is based on a telemetry study that Dr. David Anderson did. He had a grad student, Clint Boll, that did this work kind of in the early 2000s, looking at various aspects of goshawks breeding in Minnesota. So a lot of this information is based on that kind of study. Um, and may differ somewhat between Wisconsin and Michigan, but just so you know, this is mostly from Minnesota. Basically, what they found that there's a strong preference for older red and white pine and aspen birch forests. Um, the main point is that they tend to use a variety of mature and older forests, even though there may be a higher preference or more selectivity for aspen and red and white pine. and that they often avoided kind of those young forest and lowland conifer forest. More on the telemetry. So the foraging habitat that they used was very similar to the nesting habitat, um, which is important to understand in terms of managing for goshawks across their post-fledging area, kind of this bigger picture. Um, And once again, nesting habitat tends to be older with larger, taller trees and more of a closed canopy. The other thing to realize is that their home range size for a pair is quite large. So that makes goshawks a very difficult species to detect because they can cover a lot of ground and move around a lot. A lot of times they have alternate nests within kind of their breeding territory, and they can be separated by vast distances. So even though we go into an area and look for a nest and it's not occupied, that doesn't always mean that the territory really isn't occupied. It's just that we didn't find the potentially the active nest. Thinking about their diet. Once again, this is from work that Dr. David Anderson had done with folks, mostly using a variety of small to medium-sized birds and then small mammals. Um, you know, snowshoe hare, I think, is definitely on the larger side, but goshawks have been found to take adult snowshoe hares, which certainly weigh more than themselves, so they can take quite large prey. Um, but if you were to look at numbers, snowshoe hare, they probably forage less on them, and forage more heavily on, say, red squirrels, chipmunks, and some of the other birds that they're eating as well. So pretty varied diet. They're kind of, they're not a super specialist in terms of their diet. So kind of switching gears and talking about the conservation status of goshawks. And thinking about this across the eastern North America, basically it has been shown that there's been significant declines, and this is from, migration site monitoring. So nine of those sites have seen significant declines in the past 20 years. The graph that you see here is from Hawk Ridge Bird Observatory in Duluth. If you haven't had a chance to visit Hawk Ridge, I would highly recommend it. It's a great place to watch hawk migration, um, and it's pretty amazing actually to see the birds migrating there. You can often get really close up looks at them as they fly right by the ridge. In any case, but you can see that this data comes from the 70s, early 70s. Doesn't go to 2024, but um, you can see these differences and um, these these peaks or spikes in numbers that are counted, and those are those eruption years when um, it's suspected that the snowshoe hare numbers crashed further north, and so it forced down a large number of goshawks about every 10 years, and you can see that for the 70s into the 90s. Although you can see that peak has gone down significantly. I will say also that in those years when we have these big eruptions, the vast majority of birds that were counted were adults and they weren't young. Because there was no hares to eat, they weren't producing many young. So the vast majority of birds were adults that were moving in during those eruption years. If you ask me a question about why the decline, and why we seem to be losing these cycles, I really don't have a strong answer for you. I've heard different theories, but nothing that really um, leads to like a good for sure. Like, yeah, this is kind of what's going on because goshawks occur. The primary portion of the range is in these remote areas. They're poorly monitored in Canada. Um, so it's hard to know. Obviously, loss is something that I think people are considering and concerned about. Another factor that I think probably has a bearing on goshawk is we are noticing a much larger increase in scale and intensity in wildfires in Canada in that boreal forest region. So we're seeing, much larger acreage and size of these burns, and intensity. So do some of these wildfires have influence on goshawks populations? It's very possible, um, but it's hard to say for sure. So within the upper Midwest, kind of thinking of that Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota region, goshawk is designated as a species of conservation concern across many different organizations, such as the state DNRs, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, tribal governments, Audubon. So there's a lot. There's definitely conservation concern for goshawks. Within Minnesota. It has a state listing of species of special concern, which was instituted in 2013, kind of because of its low abundance and concerns about possible habitat loss from timber harvesting. On the Superior, it is listed as a regional forest or sensitive species. Now, all national forests across the U.S. have a list of regional forest or sensitive species that varies. It kind of depends on where you are, the kind of the local things that are influencing certain critters within that national forest. So even within the Great Lakes region, there's three national forests or four national forests that occur. They're not all national forests within the Great Lakes region actually have goshawk listed as a regional forest or sensitive species. But because of that listing, that status, uh, that does mean that we have some kind of standards and guidelines that we apply when we are doing vegetation management on the Superior. Those kind of live and have been defined within our forest plan. So the forest plan is kind of your ultimate direction of where you want the national forest to go in terms of a variety of different things. National forests are a multi-use forest, so it's not just about timber harvesting or recreation or anything, but that's all of those things that we have to consider when we are managing. So having a strong forest plan and having standards and guidelines for species such as goshawk is really important for conserving the species into the future. Kind of as I mentioned earlier, um, goshawks are a difficult species to detect, and they have large territories, um, and so they're challenged in terms to manage the habitat because of the spatial. There, you have to think about spatial scale and arrangement of habitats across the forest. And once again, fortunately for the Superior, we have like large patch management, forest plan standards and guidelines that we do use. That's not necessarily related to goshawk, but certainly is a benefactor of that kind of plan or standards and guidelines for large patch management. So, when we think about things on the forest, we often think about things for a multitude of different species, not just single species management. So, when we're thinking about all this, we're trying to provide habitat, older forests for a variety of different plants and species, but also for species of wildlife that really need that forest interior habitat. So, kind of switching gears to some of the monitoring and research that is ongoing in Minnesota. And a lot of this work is spearheaded by Gia Crozier. She is the non-game specialist with the Minnesota DNR, and she kind of is the champion and spearheads a lot of the efforts that occur for goshawks in the region. So, all the national, the Chippewa, the Superior, the University of Minnesota and tribal governments, we all collaborate with GIA to monitor goshawks on these lands. And of course, I had to throw this picture in there. Some of you that know me probably know that I'm a total bird nerd, but I really love owls. And when I had to throw this in there because it's kind of related to monitoring. This nest right here actually is a goshawk nest, but the birds that are on it are not goshawks. They're actually great gray owls. Great grays often are secondary users of goshawk nests, and most of the great gray owl nests that we do find on the Superior are in old goshawk nests. So I had to throw that in there. So as I kind of mentioned, there's kind of this collaborative effort that GIA kind of spearheads. It's been ongoing since 2003. There are about 70 to 80 territories that are monitored annually, with about 60 of those that are active in a given year, usually. Um, Basically, we are conducting broadcast surveys. So when we find nests, any kind of nest in it, even if they're alternate nests, we will go to each one of those nests and do kind of these broadcast surveys at various times of the year to determine if a site is occupied, and then to see if they're incubating, and then we go back at the end to kind of see if a nest was successful or not. So there's kind of three different survey windows that we do checks on. Um, so really trying to get at that occupancy, nest success, how many chicks are produced. These graphics kind of show that kind of information. The territory occupancy rate, which is on the left-hand side graphic, which is occupancy and nest success. Um, Excuse me, occupancy is kind of that darker color, and the yellowish color is the nest success. Um, You can see that occupancy rate is around 77%, but you can see that it varies quite a bit. Same with nesting success, it's around 67%. And that compared to number is kind of based on other studies across North America that have been done. So kind of Minnesota's success rate is kind of in the middle there. Productivity in Minnesota is about 1.6 nest or 1.6 young per successful nest. And once again, you can see that that varies quite a bit, and then also how it compares to other studies that have been done in North America. Um, in terms of kind of the nesting tree species that have been found from this data, the vast majority, 70%, are kind of in aspen trees, with the remaining in a variety of different types of trees. Why aspen tends to be used more heavily. I think there's a couple potential reasons. One is that aspen often is a tree that has kind of those multi-forked crotches that provide suitable base for a nest to be situated in. The other fact is that aspen, at least in Minnesota, is a relatively dominant tree on the landscape, so it's potentially just more available to use. But I think a really important part of that is that multi-forked crotch to provide that suitable structure for a nest. In terms of the forest type of the nest stand, and thinking about nest stand, think about on the scale of around 40 acres. About 40% of the nest stands were aspen forest, 30% are in red pine, um, and then the remaining is kind of a variety of different forest types. Um, and then age of the nest stand, as I kind of mentioned earlier, they're often in these mature and older forests, and the data kind of reflects that with over 70% of the nest trees or the nest stands and occurring in stands that are greater than 60 years old. For the average age, aspen is 65, and then for red pine, it's a much older. I think an important thing to consider is, especially for the aspen at 65 years old, there there's a lot of foresters would have different ideas about aspen being harvested earlier than 65. Aspen is one of those species that gets heart rot. And of course, once you get heart rot in the aspen, it has less timber value. So there is kind of this competing interest for certain markets for pulp and whatever other timber commercial values, but also providing enough older aspen for kind of these these species that really need that kind of habitat. And it's not just goshawks, because of heart rot, aspen tends to be a tree species there's a lot of cavity use in those trees. And so, a tree that's only 40 years old or 50 years old, it probably doesn't even have heart rot, and it wouldn't even be suitable habitat for like a cavity nester. Um, in terms of the nest area, and once again, thinking kind of on that scale of 40 acres, this that site is composed of about 60% quote unquote goshawk habitat. How that it has been defined is based on work that Clint Bowl had done, and looking at preferred habitat use of forest age or forest type and age class. So basically, that meant that the main habitats were aspen, pine, spruce, and fir, um, and less, not so much young forest within that nest area. And then the post-fledging area, which is a much larger scale, about 500 acres, composed of quote unquote 41% goshawk habitat. And I should also mention that they also, in terms of that preferred habitat, it was kind of broken down between early successional and late successional habitat. That kind of early successional habitat was really, and think about forest types of like aspen, birch, and spruce fir. Um, but those kind of preferred, it was, stands that were at least 25 years of age. And then for the more later successional habitat or forest types, thinking like red pine and maple, it was stands that are older than 50 years of age. So once again, it's older forest tends to be more important for goshawks, but they are somewhat adaptable, and you do find other types of forest within these post-fledging areas. So, the DNR has also done some exploratory modeling to look at things that might be correlated with the nest area. A couple things that they found is, and this is not a big surprise, is that it's nesting attempts and nest success are positively associated with more mature forest of aspen and birch forest, and they're negatively associated with young aspen and birch, and the overall amount of harvesting that has occurred within that nest area. Also, in terms of nesting attempts, um, it seems to be negatively correlated with that mature lowland conifer forest. This is another way of showing, the importance of mature forest within the nest area for goshawks. So on the x-axis, you see it's the proportion of mature aspen birch within the nest area. On the y-axis, it's the probability or likelihood that you'll actually have a nesting attempt occur. And basically, you can see that as you get closer to having no harvesting done within that nesting area, the probability of a nesting attempt occurring is quite high. So it's just an interesting way to view the data and reflect that, the importance of having that more older forest within the nesting area does seem to have an influence on goshawks. So this is kind of looking at the timber harvest within goshawk territories. And this data is based on all the data that has been combined across those different ownerships and the different agencies that are collaborating on this kind of monitoring effort. But basically, 80% of the territories were abandoned after a harvest in the nest area occurred. I think it would be interesting to get more refined information about that in terms of scale, type of harvesting, et cetera. And that kind of leads into that second bullet point, which is that I think GIA is really interested in doing kind of some more experimental type work with different management techniques within nesting areas that have some harvesting, and then have some controls to really see how that does influence and affect goshawks. One of the things that they have noticed, and is definitely an issue within these nesting areas that have had timber harvest, it creates, especially if it's a clear cut, it's creating kind of this more open landscape. And species like great horned owls take advantage of that, and they are a much more aggressive predator, and usually outcompete goshawks and would then overtake that territory. This is another thing that's, well, it's relatively new, but has been a really interesting thing. We've been working with G on this quite a bit on the Superior, and that is collecting information on DNA from individuals. So this has been a great way to monitor specific individuals in a non-intrusive way. So we don't have to capture birds. We can just go to the nesting area and then look for molted feathers. Um, so we have about 107 different individuals identified. It's definitely biased towards females. The main reason for that is that the focus of looking for molted feathers often is right around the nest tree, and the females obviously spend a lot more time at the nest, by the nest, than the males do. The males are often out foraging and bringing prey back. So definitely biased towards females, although we have gotten males um, as well as excuse me, some of the nestlings. And from that information, basically have shown that there's kind of a strong, they have strong site fidelity, meaning they like to go back to the same nest year after year. I will say we have had females that have moved up to 60 miles or more between territories. So once again, this is just a really valuable tool to kind of better understand some of the demographics and movements of goshawks without having to capture them or put telemetry on them. Um, Kind of wrapping up kind of the monitoring and research, there's one thing Ryan had mentioned this, I think he did anyways. There was a Western Great Lakes region population assessment done. This was baseline data collected in 2000, excuse me, 2008. So basically, across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, within kind of the basically the northern parts of those states, that's where these types of this type of work did. What they did is basically looked at, they modeled high quality habitat for goshawks, and then so they had that mapped out, and then because there's obviously a lot of habitat out there, they then did a stratified subsample of areas that they would go and survey for goshawks across that region. And from that, they found that about a third of those suitable habitat sites were occupied by goshawks. And as you can see, at least in Minnesota, that would be a huge standard deviation there. But it gives you an idea of population estimate of pairs in Minnesota. Um, but at least it's something to work on. I think there's ways that we can refine that. Um, and once again, due to their low abundance and detectability, it's really not possible to detect strong populations without putting a lot of money into conducting surveys at a much larger scale. So it's a difficult thing, but this population assessment is something that could possibly be redone into the future to kind of reflect as on what is happening now and maybe utilizing some of the newer technologies to help aid in that process. And this is just a map showing kind of where those population assessments were done across the three states. And then the upper map on the right is kind of looking at that habitat suitability thing. And then on the bottom is kind of where those surveys were conducted and then where detections occurred within that tri-state region. Okay, now this is it's kind of monitoring related, but it's something that I think GIA has been thinking a lot about, and it's because goshawks are so difficult to detect sometimes, you have to think of other ways to try and monitor populations. And one of those might be looking at habitat trends. Could that be a proxy to kind of assess how goshawks are doing? If we are seeing that there is a lot of suitable habitat, especially as we gain more information about what we are deeming as suitable habitat, we might have a better understanding and feeling about their conservation status within the state. So some of the things that GIA has looked at, and this is specifically related to state lands in Minnesota. So it doesn't include the state or the counties and the federal agencies or tribal or anything else like that. But what they found on state lands is, between 2004 and 2022, there's been about a 61% loss of older aspen habitat. And you can see that kind of in the graph there. And projected out to 2028, they're thinking that it could be up to an 89% loss. And I will say the reason they say it's projected is that this information is based on what is planned to be harvested, not what has been harvested. And oftentimes, what is planned to be harvested, not all the stands often do get harvested. So that number could be on the high end of that potential loss up to 2028. But it does it does have some cause potentially some concern that are we losing a lot of suitable habitat, aspen habitat for goshawks? Is it sustainable to continue to harvest at that rate, or do we need to kind of scale things back a little bit? And then G kind of looked at all landowners, so this would include, the counties, the feds, and of course, private lands. And what that number shows there is that there's been, for older aspen and birch, there's been about a 6% decline um, between 2003 and 2015. And then kind of leading into that question, like, is public and private lands, are they kind of similar? I think the big catch there is that we have that kind of habitat information on public lands, but on private lands, we just don't have good habitat data. We really don't know much about what forest types and forest ages are there on private land. I will say that Chris Beal, he's a biologist on the Superior, has been working on an all lands model that kind of crosses over those land ownerships to really look to better look at habitat. So it's going to be an idea, and as we have these new technologies like LiDAR is a big one. That modeling may only be better in terms of being able to identify what kinds of habitat is occurring or is there on these private lands to better understand the differences between public and private lands. Um, so that's something to think about there. Um, so thinking about the territory itself, overall, there's kind of been this average habitat about 20 of loss of about 26% during a 10-year period on all ownerships. Um, in Goshawk territories, they may be more at risk than habitat trends indicate. And once again, that could simply be a function of not knowing as well what's happening on private lands. Um, and then, these using these larger complex of older forest, um, they may be more vulnerable to timber harvest, simply that that's where some of the older wood is located. Um, and so that's where some of this harvesting can occur, and you can chip away at some of those bigger blocks of forest. So Once again, on the Superior, we're lucky that we have kind of these patch management guidelines um, that are helping us make decisions about the number of patches and the size of those patches of different forest types, um, uh, so that we aren't necessarily getting to a tipping point of losing some of these bigger complexes of older forest. So lastly, I'm going to focus a little bit on some of the management recommendations and guidelines that are out there. In no way that this is not a completely comprehensive list, especially when it comes to Michigan and Wisconsin. I tried to get as much information as I could, but certainly there could be things that are missed. So if you feel like I've missed something, I apologize, but I'm just going to give you an idea of what some of these guidelines are for the various states and then on the Superior. So in terms of Michigan, basically the take-home message here is in terms of the nest site, they are putting a buffer around the nest where they are not allowing any kind of cutting or road construction and avoiding that kind of human disturbance factor. And then they add an additional buffer to on top of that smaller buffer right around the nest to minimize or not have any management activities occurring between April 1st and July 30th, which would fall within their kind of their breeding season time frame. Um, Number three, I'm not gonna lie, I wasn't able to really get a hold of that woody biomass harvest guidance documents, so I'm not 100% sure as to what this is reflecting, but I have a feeling it has to do with leaf trees within kind of those nest areas. Basically, wanting people to leave trees rather than just have a clear cut occur within kind of that nesting area. And then thinking of the bigger picture in terms of the management area guidelines for uneven aged harvest areas, having blocks, bigger blocks of 300 acres or more of kind of that mature upland forest type that has kind of that moderate to higher canopy closure, of 70% or more. And then another thing that they were considering was retaining a minimum of one suitable deciduous tree for, like, say, a nest every 5 acres. And then for even aged harvest areas, basically retaining um, all patches of large or generally large DBH deciduous trees. And then the other thing is kind of trying to maintain coarse woody debris. So CWD it's not chronic wasting disease. It's actually coarse woody debris for those prey species such as like chipmunks. Okay, and then Wisconsin. Um, this is where I really couldn't find a whole lot, but once again, something that they considered is creating this no-cut buffer to minimize activity around active and alternate nests. And then for uneven aged harvest or thinnings, trying to maintain at least 110 basal area. So basal area, for those folks that aren't really very familiar with what basal area means, try to think of that in terms of density of how many trees are within a stand. So it's the density, kind of the density of those trees. So retaining a higher density of trees within in those nesting areas. And then, of course, having that kind of timing restriction where you're limiting activities between February and August to minimize disturbance to those nesting pairs. Okay, in terms of Minnesota, the DNR had came up with actually a pretty extensive document that breaks things down into like the goshawk breeding territory, which is kind of large scale area, the nesting area, which is kind of that smaller scale, Then they have kind of this post-fledging area, which is kind of in between, and then just other management considerations. And I probably won't try and cover everything in here, but kind of the main ones. But for the breeding territory, really having kind of that mature forest condition in large patches, having or trying to maintain, higher canopy closure. One thing that, is I think is really interesting in that in all the years that I have monitored and surveyed goshawk nest sites, those flight paths seem to be an important thing to consider. So that flight path is that kind of that area, that zone between the canopy and the subcanopy. So having kind of that open space so goshawks can fly through seems to be an important component. Um, and then, of course, retaining kind of that coarse woody debris factor for prey species, and then just try not to destroy any alternate nests within a quarter mile of an active nest. Now, for the nesting area itself, they've kind of looked at this as, around a 40-acre zone right around the nest, and avoiding activities between February 1st and August 1st. Once again, that varies depending on where you are in the state or across the Western Great Lakes region. Maintain higher canopy closure. Um, protecting those trees supporting a nest for at least two breeding season, even if the site hasn't been active for a couple years. And then we continue to monitor. And then the last one is really kind of favoring more individual tree selection or small group selection within kind of these nesting areas. The post-fledging area, once again, thinking about a bigger zone like that four to 600 acre zone. Um, maintain at least half that area in greater regeneration than 1/3 of its potential height. I think the point of that is really saying that, try not to have a lot of young forest in that 0 to 20 age range, and having, maintaining more mature forest within there. And then also, once again, trying to maintain canopy closure. Other considerations that they feel will benefit goshawks is that age class distribution in large patches, reflecting natural range of variation. So that's kind of using historical information, as especially on the Superior. It's a fire disturbed landscape, and there's actually pretty good information to understand the kinds of disturbances that occur and at for the certain forest types, and then also the time intervals of those fire regimes are different depending on whether you're talking about northern hardwoods or say jack pine forest. Um, and then using a variety of different silvicultural tools to manage habitats within, you know, the breeding territory rather than just focusing on clear cut harvest. And then, of course, having a more diverse composition within your forest. Okay, and then focusing on the superior forest, broken down between standards and guidelines, which I had mentioned earlier. Standards, and these are within our forest plan. Standards are things that we will implement or adhere to when it comes to vegetation management. Guidelines are those things that we have more flexibility. But I will say that more often than not, our guidelines are things that we actually do implement, and less likely to not implement. Okay, so for those standards, our nest site or our nest area, we really look at it as a 50-acre zone. So we really try to prohibit or minimize that disturbance in that critical time frame. And then really trying to maintain or enhance that kind of high quality habitat, more mature for forests, more canopy closure within that 50-acre zone. And then the guidelines, thinking about the bigger area, that post-fledging area, minimizing that disturbance between March and August. And then not trying to maintain a minimum of 60% upland forest within that post-fledging area. of usually forest that's older, and the age of that forest is dependent upon the forest types, as you can kind of see there. So jack pine and spruce fir, it's greater than 25 years, but all of the other forest types, it's greater than 50. So, kind of ending on kind of a couple case studies that have been done on the Superior. Um, and these are sales that occurred where we actually did, um, apply some type of forest management either to the nesting area, or to the larger post-fledging area. So the Leander sale has a nest found in 2006 in a red pine stand. The nest was found during layout. Oftentimes, a lot of our nests are found during timber layout only because it's really difficult to go to every proposed stand that's going to be harvested when a lot of our vegetation management projects are on the order of tens of thousands of acres um, proposed, and to getting to every stand is difficult. So that's when we often find these stands, which does create sometimes some problems because they've already been, well, if they're in layout, that means they're getting closer to being put up for a sale and bid on. So it's you have a lot more invested in that stand at that point. So we like to find these nests way before layout. Anyways, they instituted some mitigations, the timing restriction. They retained all the aspen in this thinning unit. And I will say that, even though this is a red pine stand, and once again, this gets to the importance of those aspen trees, is that this was a red pine stand, but a lot of the nests that occurred in this stand were actually found in aspen trees. So, retaining the aspen there in those thinning units can actually be important for potential success into the future, or um, having these territories occupied. And then they had a 50-foot buffer around alternate nests that were active at one point. So the thinning occurred in late September. So in the fall, after the nesting season, they did retain about 120 BA, and they had no other harvesting that occurred in that post-fledging area. The outcome, so the nest was successful in 2015. That was the year that they did the thinning, although that was done prior to. And then they had successful nesting in 16, 17, and 18. And the site was active at least until 2021. So that was kind of interesting. And then looking at this other sale, the Dark River sale, this was found in a relatively old red pine stand the thinning was going to occur in. Um, they basically dropped a 50-acre buffer around the nest. They applied those seasonal restrictions, and once again, the goal was to retain all the aspen um, unless needed for operability. What actually happened is the thinning occurred in the fall, um, and GNA is actually not Goshawk nesting area. It's actually a different acronym for Good Neighbor Authority, which, to keep it simplified, is basically a tool for us to work across ownership, uh, um, land ownership. So we can work like with the state. So the state could potentially take over a sale that has both state and Forest Service lands. In this case, the state was kind of in charge of that sale. So we have somewhat less control over the logging contractor because we're not the ones out there. And so what actually happened was that they actually took probably more aspen than they should have. Um, and there was also additional harvest that occurred outside of the post-fledging area, but it did occur during the summer. What happened was, for the outcome, the nest was successful prior to thinning. Indeed, the next year it was not detected. And then in 2021, the territory was active, but suspected to have failed. And I don't believe it has been active since. So what does that tell us? Sample size of two, I would say it doesn't tell us a whole lot, but I think it does suggest that potentially we can do some types of management and still not have any effect on goshawks occupying territories. So I think there are things that we can learn and do within these territories and still maintain goshawks on the forest. And so this is just kind of summary of those the main forest management considerations, creating that buffer where you don't have activity, you know, um, the seasonal restrictions, trying to focus on maintaining those large blocks with higher canopy closure, trying to have coarse woody debris on the forest floor for prey species, using a variety of silvicultural tools, not just clear cut, such as individual selection, variable density thinning, those types of things that could be used that would likely have less of an impact or negative outcome for goshawk occupancy within those nesting areas and post-fledging areas. Um, and then finally, maintaining hardwood tree species within the nesting area that are suitable nest trees, kind of that multi-crotch trees. Once again, aspen does tend to be a tree that is really an important tree species for goshawks. Future efforts, and this is kind of based on a lot of what because GIA is kind of spearheading that, but we continue to advocate for protecting existing goshawk territories. We'll continue to monitor habitat trends, um, obtain better information about how private lands contribute to goshawk habitat, kind of getting to that all lands model that I mentioned briefly, getting better information about that, and improving that habitat suitability model. Gia is in the process of working on a 20-year report of the monitoring data. I think she is hoping to have that out within the next year. So keep your eyes out for that. I think there'll be a lot of great information. About just kind of the monitoring that has gone on and then some of the habitat information that is important for goshawks. And then we'll continue to collect feathers to improve our demographic understanding. And that feather collection, I think, is going to be potentially could have some value if we were to do another Great Lakes region post or assessment. Having kind of this mark recapture study type information could really improve information to understand what kind of population we do have within the Western Great Lakes region. And with that, I just want to thank you all for taking time to listen today. And if we do have time, I'd entertain any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. That was super informative, and I sounds like I need to meet up with Gia.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
geez, yeah, yeah.
Super knowledgeable, and there's a lot going on in the state that I did not know about. But there are a few questions, and I'm gonna try to ask Sharon's question in one. She has two questions in one. She was
Okay.
wondering about the goshawks are not consistent migrants, and that migration patterns are not well understood. Thus, do the migration sites monitoring trends really measure those goshawk status and numbers well? And then her second question was like, how is climate change going to affect the population over the next 100 years?
Um, so both really good questions.
Hmm.
Um, in terms of the first one, in terms of migration sites, kind of really kind of monitoring these trends anymore. I think there's likely a big that's a big consideration. And just looking at Hawk Ridge in general, the weather that had occurred during the fall is not really the same as it is now. So it's not even that long ago. 15 years ago, there were more consistent northwesterly fronts. They lasted longer. Um, and what that does is it concentrates birds along the North Shore that then funnel down the shore. Now, the fronts tend to be a day. They don't last very long, and we get a lot more east winds that likely push a lot of these migrants further inland. So yes, I think there's huge concern that some of these migration stations um, may not be capturing an accurate assessment of population trends. How do we deal with that? That's the million-dollar question, I think, because raptors in general are poorly monitored, um, other than through migration sites. Species like broadwing that is a long distance migrant, and that funnels down, and because they're a migrant that goes down to South America and they funnel through a pretty narrow band, I think broadwings you can probably assess pretty well still, but a species like goshawk or even sharp-shinned hawk, um, I'm not so sure. So I don't have a really good answer, but it's something that can be considered, and people that are much smarter than I can maybe come up with ways to calibrate this. I don't know. Um, but in terms of climate, obviously climate is that big influencer on those fronts and everything. So I definitely think climate, is a big factor in terms of how it's going to affect goshawk populations and other raptor populations. Goshawks in particular, they're more of a we're at the kind of the southern edge of their range. It's fully anticipated that their breeding distribution is just going to continue to move further north, um, which complicates things, like even for when we're managing vegetation on the Superior for range of natural variability, that's based on historical information, not based on, what we think the forest is going to be based on climate models and predictions. So can we even use that anymore? Those are big philosophical questions that I think need to be addressed. So I don't know. Hopefully, I answered your question well enough, Sharon.
Yeah, that was great. I love how you tied them with the migration and the climate because it's so true. And like the large, more ice is knocking over
Right,
those older stands, and just there's so
right.
much that is affecting all birds in general.
Yeah.
We Unfortunately, we are at the top of the hour, so we do have to respect everyone's time. But Dave, thank you so much. This was super informative. I will share all of the resources that you shared today with everyone, and I also will send out your email for contact if people have more questions. Um, but otherwise, I hope you all have a great rest of your week and enjoy the sunshine, or if you get sunshine right now. But thanks so much, Dave. That was great.
Very welcome. Happy to do it.
Yep.
Have a great day, everyone.